Hello Year 2. So this book is called A Bear Called Paddington and it's by Michael Bond. The first time you listen to this video or watch this video, you might want to listen all the way through really carefully. Then the second time you listen to it or watch it, you could follow it with the story in front of you and see if I've missed any words out. And then you can jump in with those words, just like we would do at school when we're doing whole class guided reading. Okay? Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were waiting to meet their daughter Judy, when Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry near the left luggage office. "It looks like a bear," "A bear," repeated Mrs. Brown. "On station? Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." But Mrs. Brown was. It was sitting on an old leather suitcase marked "Wanted on Voyage," and as they drew near it stood up and raised its hat. "Good afternoon," it said. "May I help you?" "It's very kind of," said Mr. Brown, "but as a matter of fact we were wondering if we could." "You? You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" The bear looked around before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." "You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America on your own, Mrs. Brown? Whatever did you do for food?" Unlocking the suitcase, the bear took out an almost empty glass jar. "I ate," it said. "Bears like marmalade." Mrs. Brown looked around the bear's neck. It said, quite simply, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." "Oh, Henry," she cried, "we can't leave him here all by himself. There's no knowing what might happen to him. Can't he come home and stay with—" "Stay with us?" repeated Mr. Brown. He looked down at the bear. Would you like that?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, "if you have nothing else." "Oh, yes," replied the bear, "I would that very much. I've nowhere to go, and everyone seems in such a hurry." "That settles it," said Mrs. Brown. "Now you must be after your journey. Mr. Brown can get you some tea, while I go and meet our daughter Judy." "But Mary—" "Mr. Brown, we don't even know it's—" Mrs. Brown thought for a moment. "I know," she said. "We'll call him, after the station, Paddington." The bear tested it several times to make sure. "It sounds very—" Mr. Brown tried it out next. "Follow me, Paddington," he said. "I'll take you to the snack bar." Mr. Brown was as good as his word. Paddington had never seen so many on one tray, and he didn't know which to try first. He was so hungry and thirsty he climbed up on the table to get a better. Mr. Brown turned away, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown, when she arrived with Judy, "what are you doing to that poor—" Paddington jumped up to his hat, and in his haste He trod on a strawberry tart, skidded on the cream, and fell over backwards into his of tea. "I think we'd better go before anything happens," said Mr. Brown. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw. "Come along," she said. "We'll take you home, and you can meet Mrs. Bird and my brother." Mr. Brown led the way to a waiting taxi. "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please," he said. The driver at Paddington. "Bears is extra," he growled. "Sticky Bears is twice as much. And make sure none of it comes off of my interior. It was clean when I set out this." The sun was shining as they drove out of the, and there were cars and big red buses everywhere. Paddington waved to some people waiting at a bus stop, and several of them waved back. It was all very. Paddington tapped the taxi driver on his shoulder. "It isn't a bit like darkest Peru," he. The man jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice. "Cream," he said bitterly. "Cream and jam all over me coat." He slid the little window behind him shut. "Oh dear, Henry," murmured Mrs. Brown. "I wonder if we're doing the thing." Fortunately, before anyone had time to answer, they arrived at Windsor Gardens, and Judy helped Paddington onto the pavement. "Now you're going to meet Mrs. she said. "She looks after us. She's a bit at times, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to. "I'm sure I shall if you say so," he replied. "The thing is, will she like me?" "Goodness gracious, Mrs. Bird, what have you got there?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear called Paddington, and he's coming to stay with us." "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird, as Paddington raised his hat. "Well, he has good. I'll say that for him." "I'm afraid I stepped on a jam tart by mistake," said Paddington. "I can see that," said Mrs. Bird. "You'd better have a bath before you're very much older. Judy can turn it on for you. I dare say you'll be wanting some too." "I think she likes you," whispered Judy. Paddington had never been in a before, and while the water was running he made himself at home. First of all he tried writing his new name in the steam on the mirror. Then he used Mr. Brown's shaving foam to draw a of Peru on the floor. It wasn't until a drip landed on his head that he remembered what he was supposed to be doing. He soon discovered that getting into a bath is one thing, but it's quite another matter getting out again when it's full of soapy water. Paddington tried calling out "Help" at first in a voice so as not to disturb anyone, then very "Help! Help!" When that didn't work, he began the water out with his hat, but the hat had several holes in it, and his map of Peru soon turned into a sea of. Suddenly Jonathan and Judy burst into the bathroom and lifted a onto the floor. "Thank goodness you're all right," cried Judy. "We heard you calling out." "Fancy making such a," said Jonathan admiringly. "You should have pulled the plug out." "Oh," said Paddington, "I never thought of that." When Paddington came, he looked so clean no one could possibly be cross with him. His fur was all soft and silky. His nose and his paws had lost all traces of the jam and cream. The Browns made room for him in a small, and Mrs. Bird brought him a pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast and marmalade. "Now," said Mrs. Brown, "you must tell us all about. I'm sure you must have had lots of adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of a bear." He settled back in the "I was brought up by my Aunt Lucy in darkest Peru," he began, "but she had to go into a home for retired bears in Lima." His eyes thoughtfully, and a hush fell over the room as everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown tried coughing. Then he reached across and poked Paddington. "Well, I never," he said. "I do believe he's fast." "After all that's happened to him," said Mrs. Brown. "Is it any wonder?" So if that's your first time of listening and watching this story, now take the transcript and follow it through with your finger, and then you will be able to jump in and say the correct words that I have missed out.